Loquacious. Repeat after me. L-O-Q-U-A-I-O-U-S. A-C-I-O-U-S. Okay. Anybody know what loquacious means? All right. Well, heard.
By the way, one other just kind of anecdotal piece of information. Many of you know that I tutor. And I tutor kids regularly in getting ready for the SAT. And one of the things I like to talk to those kids about is they feel lost if they don't have a calculator. And I tell them that when I took the SAT, calculators didn't exist. So you think about the fact that the SAT scores have dropped at the same time they've given these kids programmable calculators. And by the way, you don't need a calculator to do the SAT today. You can do it without a calculator.
Yeah. Stephen?
I once heard about this study which, hearing this information, was less shocking, but is still shocking. They gave students, they gave a test to, I think it was 100 Belgians and 100 Americans. And 70% of the Belgians passed and 40% of the Americans passed. Now, this would be normal, except for the fact that this test was on the U.S. Constitution.
But it was in Belgium, though, wasn't it?
Today's kids know this Belgium had in the U.S.
Well, every once in a while I try and dazzle people by saying I still have the slide rule I used in high school, but one of these days I'll walk into a school with it and see how many people know what it's about. But anyway, you get the general idea from Barton. We're going to develop some more of those themes. What I'm going to share with you now, once the technology cooperates, is part of a talk that I gave recently that talks about sort of what's going on in education, that sort of elaborates on what Barton says, and some of the material actually comes from him, and then talks about sort of what's going on here. So, and then I'll kind of bring it a little more current with sort of what is true in Oregon. So.
Whoops, I'll lose the cable here because it doesn't screw in. Okay.
I started out with some quotes that I thought were really interesting, and they kind of bear out some of what Barton was talking about. But there are a lot of people that probably would say that we're not too awful far from this today. And then one of my personal favorites, which Martin also has talked about. Could you move over to the side maybe? Then I won't be walking in front of you. When Barton was talking about the origins of public education, he left out one part that he develops in the other. And the first public education law in America was actually part of the Code of 1650, which you can find out a lot about what you need to know about it by seeing its title. You know, when legislatures pass laws, they give them pretty little names. This was the old Eluder Satan law. And the basic idea there was if you had a community where there were more than 50 families, they had to establish a public school. Once they had 100 families in that community, they had to hire a teacher. And he alluded to the Northwest Ordinance in Article 3, and that's, again, a quote that he shared with us, and that was incorporated when he said that under the new Constitution, they said we want to make sure everybody understands. So that exact law was then enacted under the Constitution in 1789. So let's talk a little bit about purposes of public education. Doug found this quote And I think it really kind of captures, it gets started in the right direction and comes from 1644. Now, the crazy part of me, the contrarian in me, thinks sometimes about going to perhaps a school board meeting or some other school setting and starting to rattle off some of these quotes. Either I'd be thrown out of the place, or people would say, "Are you sure that's really what they said?"
I'd actually disagree. I think more people would be saying, who's that person?
Well, at least Milton's got a little bit of cred as, being a classic writer. Whether anybody knows what he wrote, I suppose, is up to
Isn't he the one who wrote Paradise Lost?
Uh-huh.
The one that he was not here with us while he was writing it? Wasn't he?
I think you ought to do a presentation on that so we know the answer to that question.
Well, I learned it in school, so I'm not sure what I learned.
Anyway, again, looking at purposes of public education, it was not just so you learn stuff. It was that you learned stuff that mattered, and it was trying to instill principles of virtue and liberty. And you'll have to forgive that Noah Webster threw in the word liberal in there, but he meant that differently than we did. The part that really jumped out at me was the last phrase, with an inviolable attachment to their own country. We'll come back and talk about that.
Yeah, IB schools.
Yes, IB schools. So, but lest you think that Noah Webster was the only one that said that, David Barton referred to Dr. Benjamin Rush. But again, you see the whole idea that foundation is religion. And if you don't have that, you have no virtue. Without virtue, there's no liberty. Without liberty, no Republican government. That's kind of plain speaking. So, and it's been a while since we heard about him, but Gouverneur Morris, who hung around with all these guys, again confirms this idea that religion is the basis for morality. Now, mind you, we're talking about people who were speaking of and who were instrumental in establishing public education in the United States. Okay, so if we want to go back to roots, these are the guys who got it all started. And I dare say they probably don't teach that in most education programs nowadays. So let's talk a little bit about Oregon. And this is fascinating to me. For about the last 20 years, periodically I've delved into the statutes to find out what the schools are supposed to be up to. There's all kinds of good stuff in there. If you walked into the average school board meeting and started rattling off these statutes, everybody would look at you as if you had two heads. And yet, this is what the law requires. And of course, we all know that education is a major civilizing influence, because as we've gotten smarter, we've become more civilized.
Yeah.
And we've learned better ways of killing each other.
Okay, and we have a responsible and informed citizenry. But again, to save the best for last, students must be encouraged to learn of their heritage and their place in the global society.
What's the date on this?
Well, you can go on Legislative Council website and it'll spit it right out at you. But it's been around for quite a while.
But not
Where did the
1840.
turn happen? Was it slow or was it fast?
Well, early 60s is kind of when it...
Well, before you go off of this, though, just think about this, the way this is worded. This can mean anything,
Yeah.
right? You can learn of your heritage that, we were all bad slave owners and responsible for most of the world's ills, and it would satisfy that requirement.
What about the exemplary homosexuals?
Yeah.
Well, but lest you think that everybody can just get out there and be crazy, this kind of cuts that off at the knees. First of all, you notice the subject, instruction in ethics and morality. That's the actual title in the statute in the Oregon Revised Statutes. But special emphasis is to be given to instruction in honesty, morality, courtesy, obedience to law, respect for the national flag. They say the Pledge of Allegiance once a week in Beaverton schools. The Constitution of the United States, respect for parents in the home, the dignity and necessity of honest labor, and other lessons that tend to promote and develop an upright and desirable citizenry.
That's the basis.
How about respect for all humans, or the dignity and worth of individuals? Then, of course, we start to go off the rail, because then we start talking about humane treatment of animals and tobacco, alcohol, drugs, the whole deal. But
Do they have anything on there about sex education?
we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
And you know better because you've seen the slides.
Herb,
Yeah?
did Oregon ever have anything like what David Barton was talking about, linking to religion, morality, and
No, because we came along later and we kind of charted a different course.
chose a different course, you say?
Yeah.
Back in 1858? Okay.
Which might explain why a lot of the West Coast states, or Western states, are kind of a little bit more on the
Yeah.
fringe, maybe.
A lot of what Barton is talking about is stuff that didn't totally migrate west.
You're right.
So, now this I think is fascinating. And we'll talk about some other dimensions of this here in a minute, but the whole idea that the schools are in the business of teaching character development. Well, that's kind of what Barton was talking about, right? But what's the source of that? What's the philosophy behind that? Well, I'm guessing, without knowing, that the Character First education series, somebody greased somebody's money with a curriculum. And the character development programs shall be secular in nature.
Wow.
Obviously, they hadn't seen Barton's DVDs at the time.
But, okay, so you talked about Oregon coming in later, but I thought it was a requirement to be a state that they had to have a constitution that adhered to other requirements to become a state. That's what Martin's touched on, right?
Yeah, and that's something that probably, I don't totally understand and would
Yeah.
need to do some more study on, but the Oregon Constitution does not bear a lot of the things that Barton talks about that are in other state constitutions. I mean, we have, I think, 4 religion clauses in our Bill of Rights, for example. So, things are, we just develop differently in general. Let's put it that way. Okay, let's talk about who has primary responsibility for raising kids. Now, anybody who's hung around Southwest Hills for long enough knows that parents are supposed to do that. But the